Hello everyone and welcome to my talk today at IATEFL. Just to say I won't be able to take any questions today, I'm afraid, but please do contact me at my Twitter handle there, University Shed, or through my website, chrissowton.com, if you do have any questions, and I'll be very happy to answer them. So what I'm going to be talking about today is emergency English research with refugees and host communities in Jordan. And this is based on my field research in 2019 for the British Council, which was entitled Language Learning, Attitude, Ability, Teaching and Materials in Host and Refugee Communities in Jordan. The presentation today is also informed by my teacher training work in Lebanon and the UK with Syrian refugees in particular, but I've also worked extensively in other fragile states such as Nigeria, Nepal, Somaliland and Palestine. And this experience led to the publication earlier this year in 2021 of my book Teaching in Challenging Circumstances, published with Cambridge University Press. And this includes essentially a lot of the ideas, a lot of the practical recommendations for teachers who are working in emergency situations, but also in other situations around the world which can be deemed challenging. And lots of the work I have done, and this particular research, as I say, for the British Council, comes under their Language for Resilience programme. And if you're unfamiliar with that, I'll just give some brief background to Language for Resilience. This original report was published back in 2016, 5 years ago, by Tony Capstick and Mary Delaney. And what the report identifies are 5 principles for planning language education responses for displaced people and host communities. So seeing the value and importance of language learning in those situations, both the outcomes of language learning, but also the process of language learning. And these 5 principles are as follows: home language and literacy development, access to education, training and employment, language and social cohesion, addressing the effects of trauma on learning, and building the capacity of teachers and strengthening educational systems. So there was that original report, as I say, in 2016. I was also involved in a subsequent interdisciplinary report under Tony Capstick's editorship, which you can see pictured there, and then my research in Jordan follows on from that. And there are also other documents within this series, other publications within this series, if you'd like to know more. But in terms of the presentation today, there's 3 particular areas I want to talk about, and specifically the 3 changes that I would like to advocate for. So emerging out of the research which I did in Jordan, 3 particular areas which I think need to be developed and improved. So how language is perceived, how language learning is conceived, and how language learning support is delivered. And we'll look at each of these in turn. So the first one then, so changing how language itself is perceived. From my research in Jordan, there are 4 particular challenges I'd like to talk about today, and then I will identify particular solutions for these challenges. So the 4 areas for 4 challenges are: knowledge of language or languages is often prioritized over usage. The L1, the mother tongue, home language, is not used in additional language acquisition. The power of native speakerism and the right kind of language, and that there's no clear purpose for learning languages at times. So if we think about focusing on usage rather than knowledge, this is where I think that we need to move as a community within this particular context. Again, this is a quotation from one student I interviewed in Ma'an in Jordan. And he said, teachers correct grammar and pronunciation in class to show that they know particular things about the language, as they are not confident in their own pedagogy. So often we see teachers focusing on this knowledge. They almost see language learning more in linguistic terms rather than in the communicative aspects of language or the communicative value of being able to use a particular language. And from my own observation in Mafraq in the north, as a teacher of very, very low level boys, I would say they were A0 level. But what he was doing was explaining to them in English, which was B1 or B1 plus, the difference between short and long vowels. So again, the lack of pedagogy and pedagogical awareness was very obvious in many situations. And again, it's not surprising. In these situations, many of the teachers themselves are volunteers or don't have much background or experience in what they are doing. But again, the emphasis is often on the knowledge about the language. And again, correcting the difference between short and long vowels with students who could barely say a word is obviously not the best pedagogical strategy. And then another Jordanian teacher whose opening words to me when we met were, and he said his name, I've got a degree in linguistics. Again, it's that which is valorized, the knowledge of the language which is valorized and seen as important rather than the ability to use the language. Second point to make here is to work with learners to understand why they are learning language. You can see here a really nice example from, again, another place with an NGO in northern Jordan here, where the students themselves had to write their answers to questions for why do you want to learn English, what your expectations are, why is English important in our lives. So again, it was drawing from the students themselves and what they thought and what they anticipated being the importance of English. So having that understanding is so important. That will be motivating for them in their classroom. It will help the teachers and the organisations prepare a better structure for the particular courses which they're going to implement. So really trying to work with the learners to know why they want to learn English and what it's for. Language should be more than just for passing exams. In many cultures and many countries around the world, accreditation is incredibly important, and getting the certificate is seen as the main goal of language learning. And again, it's very understandable why that is the case. In fragile circumstances, fragile situations, you may be fleeing from a country, you've had to leave all your certification behind. It's quite understandable. But I think we also need to evaluate this as well. Language learning shouldn't be just about chasing marks or passing the IELTS, as it's often sort of said. Because what this does, it leads to a very reductivist approach to language learning and acquisition. Language becomes just the passing of exams and the acquisition of certificates, where we should be seeing language as so much more than this. And perhaps one way of trying to recognize this is one of the recommendations in my report, is looking at whether the international community can develop a certification in multilingualism. So not just recognizing English as an exam worth passing, as a language worth knowing, but valorizing all the languages which those people have in those particular situations and giving English equal weighting within that situation. And language can also be a therapeutic tool. And this is, I think, something really important to recognize in the emergency context. So you can see here, the picture here is an example of collaborative writing that I did. So this is working with a group of teachers in Lebanon, a group of Syrian teachers in the Bekaa Valley in the east of the country. And writing is a difficult task for most people, but especially if you are lacking confidence or you are anxious about using the language. And collaboration can be really important. It's not just speaking that can be collaborative, but writing can also be a very important collaborative task. And what I did with this group of teachers is I would say, well, write the title of a story. Okay, so they write the title of a story and I say, okay, now pass that on to your colleague. So they would then pass it around in a circle to the next person. And what you then had to do was to carry on that story, write the first paragraph of that story. And once you'd done that, you could then pass it on to the next person who writes the next paragraph, and so on and so on. So everyone is writing all the time, but by the end of it, you have a load of stories which are all anonymous because they have been collectively written. So it's a very good way of developing the participants' own levels of English. But there's also this therapy aspect to it as well. And it was very interesting to see as these stories progressed, they all tended to start quite pleasantly and with sort of background, but then they would become quite tragic quite quickly. But then often at the end, they would come round to a more positive ending. And I think it really helped to the teachers to explore some of the things that they were thinking and perhaps hadn't said before. This was in the sort of feedback they gave to this activity. And certainly they opened up a lot by doing this activity in a way that they hadn't done before. So I think we can often see language as this safe space for exploration and looking at different ideas and encouraging people to process some of that trauma, teachers especially, who often don't process their own trauma in these situations, who are dealing vicariously with lots of trauma from their students. And there are no professional services which they can access in those situations. And I think language learning and writing in particular can be a way of achieving that. And also accepting and celebrating multilingual approaches. So as I was saying, the value of that is very, very important, valorizing teachers, their own linguistic repertoires, and it's a way also of empowering and involving other stakeholders such as parents as well. So moving to a more multilingual based education, not just one which is focused on dominant languages. The second part then is changing how language learning is conceived. And again, here's just four other kind of issues which I think are particularly prevalent. One is the macro institutional level challenges. Learners don't talk about what they want to talk about. The emphasis is often on teachers rather than learners. And again, the emphasis is often on outputs rather than processes. So these are four, I think, major problem areas, and we can look at each of these now and try and look at strategies for addressing this. So language classrooms can be a mechanism for empowering students and giving them the space and the opportunity to deal with their trauma. So these are three examples that a university teacher gave me about his class. Three examples about how those students were able to explore some of their trauma within the safe space of the classroom. He said, one of my students on a bus, she faced a lady in front of her when she heard her talking over the phone in a Syrian accent. She turned to her and told her, "You are causing a lot of problems to the Jordanian people." A student said, "I have a phobia of aeroplanes. I feel scared and I feel horrified." One student talked about her experience of leaving her home and how she got to Jordan, how they were very scared of the checkpoints without papers. She didn't have any ID papers. She was so afraid her dad wanted her to go back, but by a miracle they all managed to get to Jordan. Again, what the university teacher told me is that these students had reported the value and the benefit of being able to talk about this within the class, having no real other opportunity to do this. The classroom was the safest space by which they could do this, and they really saw the value and the benefits from being able to do this. Here is another wall from an NGO's classes here. Again, the students are able to explain what they think, to use their English in a positive and constructive way, both for the good and for the sort of negative as well. And again, it's not saying you can only be positive. We do see some positivity there. You know, I'm happy, I'm feeling happy, I love, I'm excited and so on. But there's also, I am bored. I'm sad because I have not found my cat. You know, these are very real things, the very real ways that students are able to use that language. And again, it's having those opportunities to genuinely explore those issues and to explore the kind of things which they want to talk about. And again, one of the messages I heard time and again within Jordan, but also in some of my other work, is that so many students feel that the classroom is the safest space for them. They feel safer in the classroom than they do at home. And so they are more likely to be able to explore and discuss these ideas within an educational situation, and specifically a language learning situation. Education should be process and output focused. It's not just about getting the right mark. It's not just about the outcomes of education. It's what happens during the education as well. And within education, but specifically again, I think within language learning, is the opportunity to develop those life skills or those soft skills. So that can be through the kind of learner-focused pedagogy that we try and encourage within English language teaching. You know, giving students particular roles, the teamwork, leadership, working together, negotiation, all these sorts of things. So they are implicit in some of the task types which we can integrate into the teaching which we are doing. But these can sometimes also be explicit. So again, one of the things I saw in a class observation is teachers modelling how to borrow pencils. So many of the children in these situations, they've missed so much education. They don't have the norms. They don't understand the norms of being in a school environment and what you should and should not do. So sometimes it's necessary to explicitly talk about these particular things. And there's also the emotional literacy part, that the classroom is a safe space and that we can use another language, a neutral language, in order to explore some of these things. And this is in a context where this is seldom possible. Students may not feel, or young people may not feel able to do this in their own language, but they may feel better able to do that in a different language because there is that distancing aspect which is there. This is an example of a sort of a trauma-sensitive pedagogy which could be used. This is something I used with the Syrian group I was working with in Lebanon, and it's a way of linking literacy with that trauma-sensitive ideology. So you could suggest where students should come to the front of the class and hold up the letter A, as you can see here. And the teacher tells a story. So the teacher says, once upon a time, there was a letter A. The A lived on her own. And then the teacher can ask the class, how do you think the A felt? The response, yes, sad. So the student can then draw a sad face on the letter A, as you can see here. And then the teacher can ask the class, well, how can we make the A feel better? And then the response is that the students draw as many A's as they can in 10 seconds. So they get their paper out, their book out, and they write A. And say, well, okay, you're right. Well, now there were lots of A's. And then the teacher asks again, how does the A feel now? And then the student can change the sad face to a happy face. So again, what we can do here is we are really teaching the literacy in a fun and interesting way. It doesn't feel like learning, you know, it feels like fun. But what we are telling that individual student and that group of students is that they can make a difference. They can have a positive impact on their friends' lives, on people's lives. And in a situation where they may not feel they can feel they're a burden, they can feel they are just a problem, you know, telling them, no, you have agency, you can make a difference, is a really, really powerful message. And it's a message they may not be getting from many other people in their lives. But we are linking it to the learning of language as well. So we're getting the double the value of the classroom time. And since classroom time can often be so limited, the more we can extract from it in that way, the better. And the last section then is changing how support is delivered. So some of the challenges then in terms of how language learning support is delivered. Digital solutions are often seen as a silver bullet, a sort of a panacea to solve all problems. Language teachers have poor skills in the target language or the language of instruction. The training is often centralized and top down. And training often ignores stakeholders other than teachers, so other stakeholders are not really involved in the process. So some of the solutions then to this, well, one is involving stakeholders in digital creation. So refugees are often not involved in the process of developing materials. There's an example in Lebanon that I know of where a large organization came in with a preconceived idea of what it wanted to do. It wanted to develop a MOOC, a massive open online course, but whether or not that was appropriate for the context was I think highly debatable. Certainly what they had preconceived, but they were not involving the refugees in that process. And I think this is one of the challenges, is that what happens in academia or what is found in research papers often doesn't translate to the grassroots. It's not used. So there may be a recognition of the importance of agency and empowerment in these situations, but often these large organizations come in with preconceived ideas of what they want to do, and that is not always best for the particular situation. And there's often little appreciation of the digital constraints. So it's one thing looking at the content, but you've got to locate these programs. With regards to data, is data available? What are the data costs? Can people afford those data costs? What hardware do people have? What is the connectivity? All these sorts of things. So really appreciating the digital landscape is also really, really important. It's not just about the content, it's all of those other things that go along with it. It's no good just handing out tablets to people. You've got to think, well, can they access the things? What happens if those things break? If they're using lots of video and images, that's going to cost a lot for the user to participate in. And again, focusing is often on the tech or the platform rather than the content. So that is creating a really sort of good platform, as it were, a platform that works really well in an office somewhere, but does that work in the field? Does that work in reality? And active users of MOOCs are often working with resettled refugees in third countries rather than countries of first asylum. So again, we need to perhaps change that emphasis. There are many, many more refugees in countries of first asylum rather than in more Western countries or countries where they have been resettled in third countries. It's also important to upskill teachers in their language as well as their pedagogic skills. Again, something coming out of my research was the very low levels of lots of English language teachers in Jordan. At the higher levels, at universities, it was often pretty good, but at the lower level, working with ECD, primary level, secondary level, the levels were quite weak. So that's also important to improve their own language skills as well as their pedagogic skills. And a related issue, I think, is that when teachers go online to search for materials, because often, obviously there are no resources, they have to go and find these resources online. They don't know what resources are good and what resources are not so good. You go online and search for something, you get 100, 1,000, 10,000 hits back. Which of those do you use? Which of those materials do you use? And I think it's important that big organizations which have lots of knowledge should develop a kite mark program for this. So it can be saying, these materials are good, or having some kind of repository where these good quality materials can go. And this can be very useful for teachers in those situations who lack skills, lack awareness, lack a long background in teaching, and also lack language. This can really help them in order to be able to identify what materials they should be using in their teaching. The teacher training model should be dispersed, collegiate rather than hierarchical. Again, we often talk about in these teaching programs about the importance of being learner-centered, etc., etc. But the model of delivery can often be very teacher or trainer focused. So we need to model the kind of teaching that we want people to do. We need to not be hypocritical as trainers, but to model those sorts of things and empower teachers genuinely to be responsible for their own development. And creating networks both in a particular area but also specifically within schools, I think, can be very beneficial. Whether that is face-to-face support, regular meetings that people have, or whether that's digital. Again, I was involved in setting up a number of WhatsApp groups for teachers, which were successful. They weren't perfect, but they did often help teachers in terms of sharing ideas and being proactive in supporting each other. And teacher education should be institutional and systematic rather than individual. Now, obviously, in emergency situations, populations are mobile, but institutions are static. And you would often find if you focus too much just on individuals and supporting particular individuals, they will be moving on for whatever reason, and with it, that knowledge goes. And that can still be okay. That individual may go and teach somewhere else. They may go and use those skills and that knowledge somewhere else. But the institution stays. So when teacher training happens, you should be using, you should be working with 2, 3, 4 teachers from particular institutions wherever possible, rather than just focusing on the best teacher or the teacher with the best English. And beyond this, it's about involving all stakeholders to make long-lasting changes. So not just teachers, but parents, community members, school governors, if it's in a formal education setting, all of these people to explain and to show what you're trying to do. And this will be a way of really making a step change, meaningful change, rather than just little bits and pieces here and there. To make that meaningful step change, I think those are some of the changes which are necessary. So in conclusion, a couple of points. One is the irony, I think, of the etymology of the word education. So education from the Latin means to lead out. But in mobile settings, I'm not sure that the way in which language is perceived or conceived or language teaching is delivered allows that to happen. So hopefully some of these recommendations I've made would result more in that, would hopefully lead more to a situation where that can take place. And I think the final thing I'd say is that within education and emergency context, there's generally only 2 constants. And that is there are teachers and then there are learners. Those are the only 2 things which will be in every situation. So we need to start with that. That's the absolute basis. That's the sort of ground zero, as it were, of what we're trying to do. And anything else we can do on top of that is a bonus. But starting with that in mind, there are teachers and there are learners. What is the best that can be done within that situation? And recognizing that it will not be perfect, but there are still very positive things which can take place in that situation. So as I say, I'm afraid I'm not able to be here for any questions, but if you do have any questions or you want to find out more about the report or anything else, please do feel free to contact me to discuss further. My details are there. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that interesting and useful, and best wishes for the rest of the conference. So thank you very much, and bye-bye.